Thank you to the UKNOF organization for inviting me to speak. Thank you to our UK partner Scrutiny for proposing this talk. As was mentioned, I'm the final speaker, so I guess maybe a little bit of excitement just to get to know me a little bit better. I've been doing cybersecurity for 30 years. Worked for a long time at Microsoft, helped to develop a lot of the Microsoft security technologies in the late 90s and early 2000s. You can curse me or thank me, whatever is most appropriate. I have developed a lot of technology to keep critical infrastructure safe, serial cyber entrepreneur, and something personal about me is I love to restore Volkswagen T1 combis. So any Volkswagen restorationists out there, hit me up on LinkedIn. Happy to talk about restoration tips. Now, on to what we're here to talk about. 2020, so many exploits, so little time. We're going to talk a little bit about the complexity that is the Microsoft 365 platform and how attackers are focusing on it to basically bring about persistence and data exfiltration opportunities that most organizations are not prepared to deal with today. Then we'll take a step back and talk a little bit about the big picture. So this is an eye chart. It's meant to be so. I don't expect you to be able to read every single cell here, but the main gist of this is from March of 2020 until the present, I have not seen this many cyber weapons deployed in anger in 30 years of working in this business. If you take a look at what took place from March to September of last year, you had the FireEye tool proliferation, where FireEye and the Mandiant team had their red teaming tools stolen. The FireEye team did a great job of notifying people with indicators of compromise to look for those things, did a great job of setting an excellent example of ethical notification to the community. You then had the SolarWinds supply chain attack. SolarWinds didn't do as good as a job as Mandiant did in notifying the community, but they're trying to get better. You then had the VMware Workspace ONE exploit that was used to gain access to certain VMware workloads. You then had the Duo MFA bypass attack, and all of this was then consolidated into a massive pivot move into the Microsoft 365 tenants of the target victim organizations. Now, this eye chart of the columns and the red indicators, that is the MITRE attack framework. So for those of you who may not be familiar, MITRE, US research organization, the MITRE attack framework attempts to enumerate every single way that hackers can do bad things, from reconnaissance to data exfiltration to hiding their steps and everything in between. And so it's interesting how elegant once these significant exploits were run, with a very, very simple set of PowerShell commands, the attackers were able to inject themselves into the Microsoft 365 tenant of many organizations around the world. Microsoft has admitted up to 50,000. My research indicates that we're probably closer to 200,000 organizations around the world that have been impacted by the Dark Halo exploits. In addition, there was a class of attack called the Hafnium exploit. This was focused mainly, it originated in on-prem Exchange environments, but rapidly pivoted towards the Microsoft 365 environment. But what's happened now is that this has proliferated to the point where anyone who has an advanced persistent threat campaign could do this, right? So the example has been set, this weapon has now proliferated, and we should be really concerned about the ability of attackers to persist inside of Microsoft 365 environments for both command and control purposes, as well as for data exfiltration. So if we think about why did this happen? Microsoft 365 is a very, very complex thing. I started doing research in this environment in 2017. And in 2018, I was invited to do some in-depth research with an organization of over 50,000 users that was migrating rapidly towards Microsoft 365. And it was really difficult for me to totally comprehend all of the attack surface. I discovered over 7,000 settings per user within Microsoft 365. So you've got 50,000 users times 7,500 settings per user, that's a lot of stuff. It's difficult for the human brain to process that level of complexity. So I started to look for documentation. I worked with my friends at Microsoft. Is there a way for us to get better ideas of what this is? And this screenshot in the upper right-hand corner here is an example of the infrastructure as code that exists to program the settings for each one of these users. And unfortunately, the only way to interact with that mountain of settings is the Windows PowerShell environment. Now, some of us are command line experts, like we just saw with the live code demo of Willem and his team. But most people don't have that level of expertise to be able to interact with a highly complex environment only through command line settings. And so what I've started to see is that most organizations are essentially apathetic about this. What they have difficulty understanding, they essentially go, I got other things to do. I'm going to reprioritize things. So if we take a look at the culmination of apathy, complexity, attacker focus, that is what got us to the situation of Dark Halo. The Russians used that as an exploitation mechanism to get inside of, first, the US Treasury. We'll talk a little bit about their motivations here in a moment. But in our research, as we have been going with Microsoft at times to go and help to resolve these issues, less than 1 in 10 organizations have any real ability or have invested in Microsoft 365 security capabilities, detection capabilities, integrity capabilities. Now, in addition to the Dark Halo incident, the Hafnium exploits that have been going on, which have culminated in one of the most groundbreaking responses by the US government that was just announced this week, where the US government, if they find a vulnerable Exchange server associated with a US company, they are essentially going to hack into it and try to fix it before the Chinese do bad things with it. And so this is a People's Liberation affiliated attack weapon. The press coverage focused mainly on on-premise impacts, which are significant, but the long game was this on-prem exploit was being used to pivot into Microsoft 365 because the Chinese realized their Hafnium exploit capability was being reduced because the number of hybrid Exchange environments and on-prem Exchange environments were being decreased. So here's Aaron's humble opinion, right? I think the reason why the Russians decided to deploy over $50 million in cyber weapons in the matter of weeks is because when the US Treasury went to a work from home order, they no longer had access to their human assets who were inside of Treasury to gather intelligence for them. Now, the US Treasury was in the process of creating $3 trillion out of thin air, and the Russians wanted to know where that money was heading to protect their economy and also maybe make a few bucks along the way. And so they had their freak out moment to say, goodness, all this stuff is going on. How are we going to be able to get access to it? And they've been sitting on these cyber weapons for a while. This is the Dark Halo attack indicates years worth of development, potentially thousands of developers involved. And I would put a very low end conservative estimate of about $50 million in what they spent to create the Dark Halo cyber weapon package. Now, in September of last year, as a result of Dark Halo, the US government sent out executive orders to eliminate the connections to hybrid Exchange and third-party identity providers from Microsoft 365. And so what happened was the Chinese then saw their window of exploitation of on-prem Exchange being reduced. It's sort of like having a bottle of milk in the refrigerator and the expiration date is getting close. You may want to use that before it's no longer useful. And so I think that's what motivated the Chinese to do something that was very out of character for them from a cyber attack. They did a smash and grab operation starting in January that made a ton of noise. Usually the Chinese are much more quiet and patient about the way they run their exploits. But both campaigns essentially used these exploits to go into Microsoft 365 and to persist there because of the complexity and the power of that platform to become a command and control mechanism as well as a data exfiltration mechanism. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through some of the PowerShell commands that were used by these attackers to first do discovery and reconnaissance. So for those of you who are not familiar, the PowerShell commands, they follow a pretty simple nomenclature. Think of it as the syntax that is used is get, right? Is obviously they're querying, only needs read access privileges. And so in the beginning, and you could go through and look through your logs if you're a Microsoft 365 customer, and you could go looking for these types of commands that are being sent through your logs. Now, unfortunately, your logs are probably only good for 60 days, and most of this attack activity was taking place sometime in the middle of last year. Now, we see some copycats doing it now, so you may get lucky and find some of the lower tier cybersecurity, attackers that are out there trying to get things done to do a copycat attack. So you may still detect this, but essentially what you see in this list of commands are a series of get commands where the attackers want to understand who are the privileged users, what mailboxes have certain restrictions, what management roles are set inside of the Exchange Online environment, and if it's in a hybrid configuration, if Outlook Web Access is enabled, and if the web services virtual directories are enabled for certain users. Now, once they've run those commands, the next thing they do is they begin to prepare to exfiltrate data using Exchange protocols as both command and control and exfiltration channels. So now you see at the top here, these are all set commands. So these need global admin or Exchange admin privileges. And so, for example, they would go and set IMAP enabled. Now, IMAP is a really interesting protocol in Exchange because it's bidirectional. It can serve essentially as a virtual private network into and out of things like SharePoint sites, Teams channels, and that sort of thing. So IMAP is a fairly powerful tool, but unfortunately, it is a basic authentication protocol, meaning that it bypasses the multi-factor authentication requirements. So if someone can enable IMAP, then that means they've disabled the ability to require MFA on that protocol. Same thing holds true for MAPI and ActiveSync and the old Exchange Web Services. These serve as excellent bidirectional command and control and data exfiltration channels to be able to get information into and out of the environment. Now, in one non-governmental organization that we've been working with, they are a pro-democracy NGO. They are supporting Navalny, the Russian opposition leader. The Russians were using the access into the Microsoft 365 tenant of the NGO in order to target and identify Navalny's supporters, and we're using certain aspects of Microsoft 365 to do actually real-time tracking with certain Microsoft Intune capabilities. And so think of it as a weaponized platform that they were using to use some of the Intune settings to basically identify people and understand where they were in near real time. Now, no good attack can take place unless the attackers can obfuscate their activity. And so what the attackers would do is they would go and get the information about what auditing was enabled. And then once they understand, they would then use the set commands to set the logging level to 0 on administrative functions and set the logging level to 0 on certain targeted individuals inside of the environment. And so if you can disable unified audit logging, then that means that it basically creates a situation where the SIM or the Security Operations Center is blinded to the activity. And so I see a question that just came in here. We'll save that for the end, but I'll get to it in just a moment. Anyone else who has questions as I'm going through that, please go ahead and get them queued up in the Q&A, and we'll get those addressed at the end of the presentation. Now, I've been talking a lot about Microsoft 365 here, but this is not just a Microsoft problem. What the Russians and the Chinese have proven is that the SAML and OAuth authentication protocols are not up to snuff when it comes to facing these new types of software as a service attacks that we're seeing. So in December of last year, this graphic was tweeted by the National Security Agency of the United States. And it basically said, please make sure that you really simplify your authentication mechanisms so that you don't suffer golden SAML attacks, golden OAuth ticket attacks. And so basically the kill chain here is on-prem exploit, gain privileged access to components, and then either steal the private keys associated with SAML generating APIs, or to then create a new certificate of trust to then forge your own SAML interface, right? And so if you take a look at the in-depth guidance that the National Security Agency published, if you are a Microsoft 365 customer, you should probably eliminate all third-party identity providers relative to that platform. Now, that will require that you are essentially breaking single sign-on. I never thought in my life I'd be recommending the disabling of single sign-on, because single sign-on is a great thing. It reduces the number of passwords we have to remember. It reduces the friction that users have to experience in logging on to business applications. But in this case, you need to take a hard look at what your identity provider infrastructure is, because the attackers are focusing on the weak links of SAML and OAuth API generation to basically forge their own SAML and OAuth tokens to bypass multi-factor authentication requirements and gain privileged access to software as a service platforms. Now, in addition to that, we've seen many other attacks that have been successful when it comes to gaining privileged access to Microsoft 365. The global admin account takeover usually starts with a browser exploit. The targeted individual is then tricked into entering their phone number. In the case of the incidents that we've helped clean up, generally iPhone, just because iPhone is a market leader among many of the global administrators. And the vulnerable iPhone is then targeted to then clone the Microsoft Authenticator keys or other soft token key. Now that you have a cloned authenticator plus the browser credentials, you now can gain full control of the tenant. And so last November, there were 2 0 days that were reported to Apple that were being used to clone soft token or multi-factor authentication applications on smartphones. And so it is my really strong recommendation, if you have privileges inside of a SaaS tenant, that you eliminate the use of SMS or authenticator apps and use security keys like YubiKey or a Contact Smart Card or another form of hardware-separated, cryptographically driven multi-factor authentication token to avoid the abuse that we're seeing in that world. Also, we've seen where connectors and applications that are installed inside of the Microsoft 365 tenant are being used to gain access to data. For example, in Power Automate, which is sort of a light machine learning platform that Microsoft allows their users to leverage, Power Automate has a connector to the African SMS backbone. Now, why in the world would someone want to have a connector to the from their enterprise tenant to the African SMS network? Well, in my opinion, it was most likely the result of someone needing to interact with M-Pesa, which is the African mobile payment platform. And so I think that was the legitimate reason why, but we have seen several instances where the Africa's Talking SMS connector has been used to exfiltrate data and serve as command and control in and out of Microsoft 365 tenants. So I think it's really important to understand that connectors and applications hygiene is going to become more and more important. Now, what do you do? So Azure AD, oh, I'm sorry, was there a question?
It's Portia. Just to alert you, you are now 5 minutes to your Q&A.
Yep, we're on track. Thank you. So detection tools, Azure AD detection tools. CrowdStrike and Mandiant have published open source tools. Both of those are freely available, but remember that those only look at Azure AD artifacts, which are only part of the problem. You want to look for artifacts that also exist in Exchange Online, SharePoint, or Teams. We have worked, my company has worked with Scrutiny to develop a free scan, if you are interested, that goes above and beyond the Mandiant and CrowdStrike tools that looks at those Exchange Online, SharePoint, Teams, and Intune artifacts to look to see if you may have been impacted by either one of the nation state operators or one of the lower level copycats. Now, these types of attacks have also been taking place inside of other SaaS platforms. We saw one organization that had their Salesforce tenant attached to using an unauthorized API data feed. This was most likely a competitor who was scraping leads from the Salesforce tenant. We also saw Workday being targeted, an unauthorized organization entered themselves as a vendor and then started paying themselves. Really good way to monetize an attack when you can essentially just have a paycheck printed. And what we're seeing is that this proliferation is going to require the need to basically build a system where you constantly look at privilege management. You constantly try to reduce the attack surface. You harden the services that are left there, and you constantly evaluate transitive trust about how an individual can potentially share a document and make sure that that document is protected in a way as it goes through the Microsoft 365 workflow. And so if I have some quick tips and tricks, make sure that you've got good change detection on material Microsoft 365 settings, have good auditing and logging, and make sure that the auditing and logging stays constant. Have really good identity provider hygiene, where you simplify following the NSA guidance, make sure that you really tighten up the identity provider supply chain, if you will, to make sure that you've got good telemetry from any of your SAML APIs, where the SAML tokens are being issued from, and then make sure you're doing good correlation for other indicators of compromise. This is a new class of attack that many organizations are not prepared to deal with, and so I think focusing on identity provider hygiene and telemetry is going to become more and more important. So, wrapping it all up here, right? We've got a new class of attacks. And the only way that we're going to get the advantage over the attackers is if we do a good job of privilege management, attack surface reduction, service hardening, and transitive trust management. That's the process we've gone through for decades now, right? And so if we think about how we go about doing that, we've got to have the ability to understand that mountain of complexity by being able to query it, put it into our security tools, and then have constant, repeatable, managed processes to look through it. So that's what I had prepared to present today. So let me go ahead and move to the first question that we had sent through the Q&A. Hi, Aaron, Office 365
hey,
partners.
Aaron, if you don't mind, Leo Vagoda, I'm going to read out the question in a moment, but before I read out the question, Dinesh is going to bring up a poll, and this is the opportunity the participants have to rate the talks and give feedback to the program committee.
Perfect.
Okay, so while people are looking at the poll, I will read out the question, and it's from Harry Cross. He says, hi, Aaron. Office 365 partners / service providers often have access to a large number of tenants at a time. How much of an amplification factor do you think this is, please? I'm aware that Microsoft are now mandating higher standards for partners.
Yep. So we are working with several partners who are in this space, managed service providers who essentially serve as the administrators of those tenants. We've seen several instances where the SolarWinds attack was used to get inside of that partner and then to gain access to many tenants at a time. This is one of the reasons why we strongly recommend for the actual customer to have secondary logging to hold their service provider accountable, not because the service provider necessarily had intent to do anything wrong, but sometimes the service provider can be compromised through other exploits. And so I think it's going to become more and more important for end customers to hold their service providers accountable, because we saw both Microsoft was exploited. So Microsoft had problems with this, where the SolarWinds exploit went in, gained access to tens of thousands of tenants at a time. We saw partners exploited, again, tens of thousands of tenants exploited at a time. So this is a weak point. When you have that concentration of privileged users, the bad guys are going to focus on that to try to get access to that tenant.
Thank you very much. So we have time for one or two more questions. And if anyone wants to ask you a question verbally, they can put up their hand and I will then unmute them so that they can speak their question to you. I don't see any other question. Oh, I do see one panelist has raised their hand to ask a question, and that is Keith. So Keith, please go ahead and speak.
Okay, thanks, Leo. Thanks for your talk, Aaron. I mean, it's a familiar theme. We're basically in a situation where we're seeing civilian systems in peacetime being attacked by nation states. And it seems to me that that's the core of the problem, and the cybersecurity hell that we're in is not going to go away until we get to the core of that. I mean, do you have any thoughts or philosophy on how we get to this situation where we seem to be constantly at war at peacetime?
I don't think we're going to be at peace very much longer. I think that we're going to be entering a new phase where essentially we're going to move into total warfare. So if you take a look at what's happening on the Ukrainian-Crimean border right now, the Russians have approached with hundreds of thousands of troops. The Chinese have stated that they're going to probably move against Taiwan. And so I think what we're seeing is a heating up of the cyber world, where folks are essentially, the Chinese and the Russians are starting to push the boundaries, because I think we're sort of on the verge of some interesting global scale conflict. And in total warfare at a global scale, there is no such thing as civilian or government systems. There are systems, and those systems are going to be exploited. And so the best practice will be for an organization to prepare themselves to be self-sufficient when it comes to security. The government's not going to have the scale nor resources to respond and to protect everyone on their own. Everyone's going to need to protect themselves. And so, you know, it's not a happy thing that I think is going to happen over the coming months, but I think we're going to see a significant escalation in cyber warfare in ways that we haven't seen before. And I think this is the harbinger, where this is essentially the canary in the coal mine that we're seeing right now with the Dark Halo and Hafnium attacks.
Okay, thanks. Okay, you thought the pandemic was depressing. Well, then there's cybersecurity. Okay, thank you for your talk.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity.